make a motion to open the meeting?
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Great. So Glenn, can you hear us?
I don't know if he's now with us. He seems to have disappeared.
I see at the top of the head.
Yeah, yeah.
Glenn Tippett, if you can hear us, can you say something?
It looks like we lost him.
Okay.
Yeah,
He's having
he's no
trouble
longer
connecting.
on.
Okay, why don't we move on, and when he gets on, we can come back.
Great. So again, thank you for pulling that together last night. It's really good timing. We could use all the help that we can get. And that just worked out really well timing wise. Just full disclosure, I've shared this with Len already. I and my wife have unfortunately tested positive for COVID.
Oh, no.
Despite hypervigilance and everything that we could possibly think of to do. So it just shows you that we're all vulnerable. I may have pneumonia, so I'm going to do my best here. It's been a hell of a go for about 3 weeks, but on we go.
Anything we can do to help?
I'm good. I wanted to throw it out there if anybody's willing. I have, quite frankly, done a terrible job keeping our minutes up to date. I have all of our minutes. I save everything, and I will catch up on all of that, as I've mentioned to Sally. But the way that these meetings go sometimes, would anybody mind taking the minutes in lieu of my doing them going forward? It would just be helpful to have somebody else be able to take the notes.
I could do that, Charles. I'll volunteer.
Will you? It's appreciated. It's a little bit of multitasking for me with trying to just keep all this moving and then do that. So that's appreciated. Well, thanks, Len. And I will indeed catch us up on the retro minutes, all of which I have in my possession. I guess just so turning to item 2, which I don't think we have Jerry on tonight. Dan, maybe you could speak to this. The email from Jerry had referenced the staff meeting on November 25th. So I guess there's that. And then there was also the hope that the capital budget recommendations would be adopted ultimately. So do you mind just updating us on where
We'll have an
we're at with
update,
that?
because I don't know whether that took place on the 25th. I know that the staff has been multitasking on many different fronts at the moment, so I don't have a definitive answer for you. They were supposed to meet on the 25th and be back to the Board of Trustees with their recommendation. That has not yet happened.
Okay, and can you just clarify maybe for us, so the process typically with something like this, we know where we're at to date. So when we say staff meeting, do you understand what that is, and then how that then transitions to the board?
Well, basically, the village manager asked for time to review everything with different members of the staff, get their inputs, and come up with recommendations, either endorsing it as is or additional suggestions, and getting back to the Board of Trustees with their comments. I assume they would also go back to your committee, particularly if there were recommendations for changes. To date, I have not heard anything on that, and it was supposed to take place, but there have been a lot of things happening in the last couple of weeks.
I'm sure. Okay, so to be continued, and we can circle back on that when we have feedback from Jerry, maybe next month.
Yep.
and then stay with that. That's probably a good sequitur. We have a full agenda tonight, and a lot we want to talk about with respect to the operating budget. But it's probably a good sequitur to just talk about the capital budget. And during last month's call, we've tasked ourselves with the operating and capital budget to try to stay abreast of year-to-date actuals and how we're trending. And I think we've focused probably more on the operating budget trends to date than we did the capital budget. So last month we had taken a look at that, and it looked like, in short, that as has, I think, been a pattern that we were hoping to avoid, that very little of the budgeted capital budget has actually been expended. And that might have caught, I think, all of us off a little blindly. And we talked about wanting to really take a deeper dive into that. And Len and I have been in touch with Augie to share thoughts, and we're waiting to hear back from him. So as a step one, it's to kind of understand why we are where we are, what the process is, what the underlying, if any, decisions have been that kind of led to where we are, if that was strategic, what the plan is for the rest of the year, maybe to accelerate some of these projects, some of which are quite important, and that if strategically these are shelved because of whatever the reason, the forward impact could be going forward into next year's budgeting process and carryover. The other thing that we wanted to look at kind of going into all of this was to better understand the financing process, the timing of the bonds, the amortization schedules. And it's good timing with that to get our head around all of that, because we'd like to be clear about what's been financed. Are we incurring interest expense for projects that aren't being done, et cetera? That's a very broad overview. I think it's a little concerning that we ended up in December, and I didn't necessarily realize we were that off in terms of trending year to date with those numbers. I think it's something that we all probably should have had in front of us and been talking about. So I think it's a pretty big deal. It was a big objective of the framework that was developed, was to try to avoid just putting numbers on paper and then not doing the projects.
So Charles, what's interesting, I'm sorry, if you look at the debt service plan for this year, which was based on our outstanding debt before any new projects, we're at the 10% level of our operating expense. And our guidelines recommend 7.5 to 10. So in a way, it might be good that things are being pushed.
I didn't calculate that number. Based on your expense trends numbers, I came up with about between 7.4 and 7.8%, something like that.
Right. My 10% is based on the total budget.
Yes, the same calculation.
No, so if our budget was 36 million and change, and the debt service is 3.7 million, that's 10%. What am I doing wrong?
Was that it? Was that the debt service?
There's not this schedule. There's a different debt service schedule, and next year's projection was a little over 3.7.
Oh, okay. I must have missed something, because if I looked at your expense trends report that you sent around, and I add the principal and interest lines, I don't get 3 something, I get 2.7 grow, I get in the 2s, 2.8. Now that might be lower than actual. I just took what was in that spreadsheet that you shared, Ellen.
Right, but it might be
Can I
very,
interrupt for a minute? Cliff, can you promote Glenn Tibbett, who is in as an attendee, because he can only call in. He's having trouble with the video, but he's.
Yep.
So he can participate.
But that, you may be right, Ellen.
There's a debt service schedule online. That's a
Okay.
3.7, and I remember Augie telling us over the summer that the budget was 3.7 million for
Okay.
that.
Okay,
That did not include any new bonds issued in the current fiscal year.
okay. I was just taking what was in that expense trends report. That's all. So let's,
Yep.
we don't have to beat this to death now.
No, but I tried doing that too, figuring out where the 3.7 was. I couldn't find it either, Lynn.
Yeah, okay.
Oh,
If it's way down, Charles, at like line 585. of his work. I'm sorry, yeah. So it's those four lines, starting with line 527. Okay, but I accept Ellen's thing. I just looked at it, calculated it. I said, well. if
right.
this-
So it's got to be buried someplace else. And that's a question we can ask Augie. You know, there's that debt service schedule online, I think going out for 10 years or something. Where do we find it in the budget?
Yeah, because when you add up the totals on that, if you add up the approved 2021 budget in that spreadsheet, Ellen,
Yep.
you get 37 million. 37.5. So anyway, that's we shouldn't get off track with that.
All right.
This at a high level, and again, you know, the capital budget's a critical thing. This is the only piece that I'm seeing in any of the online materials. It got cut off. I don't know if, you know, there's more out there, but I've bridged that as well. But this is kind of what we're limited to. We have a $11 million 2021-22 number here. And then Augie had provided us with a collection of what appears to be the 2021, but then prior also, that kind of roll up to a number that's disconnect from the 11 that we were just looking at.
Yep.
So we have to unpack with him what this means, but this number is the one that jumps out. The year-to-date actual expended, you can see this, right? The $1,589,000.
Yep.
So I don't know how real that is, but out of $11 million, we've only spent $1.5 million. There's a lot of shit to do. I really feel like we got to get into this.
Well, I
look at
know
what's
they
going on.
approved the fire engine, which is not expended yet, but that's $1 million or close to it.
You have $1 million payment for the police retirement that still needs to be paid. This is
Right,
Glenn,
but that's not,
nice to meet you all.
that wouldn't be capital,
Hey,
would
Glenn.
it?
No,
It's an operating expense.
Right.
There have been,
you're looking for $1 million in capital?
No, we're looking for 10 million in capital.
I'm looking for 6 million, 6 million.
They just spent a
We're
bunch on
spending
fire.
11 million.
I think, Charles, the question actually should be divided in two: what's actually been spent and what's actually been encumbered. Because there have been encumbrances,
Yep.
a few $100,000 that were not budgeted, that came up. So where contracts have now been let, and so as the bills come in, they will be paid. So when you get to capital budget, you need to do both, what you actually spent, but what's been encumbered versus what's in the budget.
Yep. Look, we put a lot of time into this framework, and one of the things that really struck us as being critical was to not just throw numbers at a budget and then not do the projects.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know if this is the right number, but $1.5 million out of 11 million, and it's December. I don't know what's driving all this.
Well, let me just go down,
Let
me go down the list with you very quickly, if I may.
If anything, the fact that this hasn't been addressed, the fact that this hasn't been addressed at all by anybody the first 6 months of the year, to me, is a problem.
Okay.
It should have at least been discussed.
The sanitary sewer system is going forward, and the contract is in negotiation. I don't know whether it's been let yet or not, but that has been under as a priority of the village. I know the marinas and docks have been appropriated. A lot in the expenditures for Westchester Waterworks, which does not appear here, is going forward as well.
Yeah, the docks just had the
We all freeze.
engineering plan for the repairment of the basin approved at the last trustees meeting. So
That's Glenn Tippett, who has joined the
that
committee.
capital project of fixing the wall. The sewer system has to go out to bid because that's mandatory, or else by 2022 or 2023, we would be out of compliance with the federal decree order we're under. So I'm kind of knew what you're looking at, but they and then the waterworks, they just did a money towards the filtration plant. So those are three major projects that have gone through the trustees that I'm sure that money will be spent this spring.
So, Charles, if you would like, I can ask staff for your next meeting to have what's actually been paid and what's been encumbered and what is in the works to be encumbered, i.e. actively being pursued as opposed to just, in the budget.
Great, I appreciate that. And they're very self-directed, incidentally, just that, it was clearly a priority to make sure that the budget that was allocated was actually moved forward with. It felt like this was a bit blindsiding. So I'm glad we're doing this. We'll unpack it. Glenn, I apologize. You had gotten cut off, but welcome aboard. It sounds like you're already adding very valuable feedback. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and introducing yourself to the group? We could go around the horn as well.
Sure. My name is Glenn Tippett. I've been a resident of Mamaroneck my entire life, 58 years. I'm a former member of the Budget Committee approximately 15 years ago. I graduated with an associate's degree from Westchester Community College. I was a 7-Up sales representative, Joyce Beverages, New Rochelle. It's where the shop right is currently. I was the regional sales rep for Avion Water USA. I was a banquet manager for New Rochelle Elks Lodge. And I currently own my own publishing collectibles company that does sales online with eBay.
Wow, that's a incredibly diverse, intriguing background and very relevant. And you were with the Budget Committee for 15 years. Wow,
No,
I didn't know we
with
had
the
a Budget Committee
15 years ago.
15 years ago.
15 years ago, gotcha.
Yeah, I served out one term and
Well-
then served a second term.
And I'm sure there's a huge difference in the size of the budget between then and now.
I believe they were using floppy disk to do the finances when I first got on the budget committee.
So Charles, before we continue, I'm gonna forget. You were commenting on the spreadsheet that was cut off. That's the spreadsheet I put together and sent around to all of you. So you probably have that somewhere.
Yes,
Not that one. The capital budget one.
yeah, yeah.
Not that one.
No, not that one.
The capital plan, yeah.
Oh, our
No,
No, the one
sorry,
you.
Ellen,
did
which one are you
earlier,
referring to?
the one you said was cut off and you couldn't see all of it.
From the supplemental budget.
Yeah. This, that would be this little guy.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
it,
that one. That's the spreadsheet I put together.
right.
So you probably have it
exactly.
somewhere. Or I could resend it to you if you want.
Yep. This is, and not to whatever, but this is what's in the supplement, and I'm not seeing a capital budget other than this. And
I agree.
I don't know, I don't know if there's more out there, but that's what we're dealing with. So we'll unpack it. Hopefully, we can engage Augie and kind of go through what he had distributed, to Dan's point, where we're actually at. Glenn, you actually shed some encouraging light on what's in process, so that's great, and we'll see where we're at. But that's something we'll hopefully do better going forward, just as we have with the operating budget, to just keep abreast of how we're trending and go from there. Did anyone else want to talk about any of these items or anything else with this? And otherwise, we could move into the operating budget.
I would say let's move into the operating budget because that's going to be a lengthy conversation.
Yeah, just for note-taking purposes, I'd like to ask, Dan, were you gonna follow up with Augie and ask him,
I'm going to follow up with Augie and Jerry with an email.
what are you going to do? What's your?
I'm going to ask them for the next meeting to provide an update on the capital budget as to what actually has been spent and what is actually encumbered and what has not yet been gotten to.
And Ellen, if
Encumbered.
you could possibly email
Encumbered
me-
meaning either contracts out or actively being pursued.
Thank you.
So can you see the operating budget guidelines that I pulled up?
Yes,
Great. Ellen had also distributed state controller, the framework that drove a bunch of this. That was a super helpful document. Obviously, you guys incorporated a lot from that into this. Thank you for the quick, thorough work with putting the document together. Do you guys want to kind of take us through this and we can talk about where it's at and next steps? Ellen, do you want to run with that or?
I was on mute. Sorry, I was talking. Before we go through this, when I said I would put something together, and I have to say Ed did most of this, it was with a focus on what we did with capital guidelines, which included planning, that this should include operating planning guidelines as well as adjustment guidelines. So Len, do you want to talk to that, why you thought we should expand the scope?
Well, thank you, Ellen. No, when Ellen asked Ed and me during this subcommittee to look at her draft on the budget adjustments. At least my initial thought, given the fact that we've talked about, for example, looking at the cost and revenues of events as one example, as well as the current circumstances in this difficult year, thought it might be helpful for us to expand the scope of what we talked about in the guidelines to make it more comprehensive. And then, quite coincidentally, Ed came back with his expansion of Ellen's original draft by adding the revenue shortfall section and really making the document more robust, which at least I think Ellen and I thought was a very good thing to do.
Yeah.
So in a sense, this document is really a very initial draft I would submit for us to get comments from everyone and then think about how we think about going through the operating budget, really starting very soon. Now, I don't know, Ed, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I don't think I need to add anything. You know, Charles covered some of the points that are made in that section on the revenue shortfall are things that came from that state controller webinar I attended and the PowerPoint that was distributed for that. You know, so I just took some of those points because the revenue, you know, we're talking about changes in the budget during in the middle of the year, and you know, you might need to make changes because of revenue shortfalls as well as increased expenses. So
And
that's what I intended to do.
What jumped out at me when you threw in all the stuff on the revenue, you know, when we're doing the initial budget, it's a balanced budget. So we have enough revenue, you know, revenue and expenses equal. And as the year progresses, we're not necessarily hitting our revenue numbers and we're increasing the expense budget. So the gap just widens. And I'm not sure that's good practice.
Well, no, it's not. That's not a good practice. If that's
Right.
But you know, we're in a particular environment where we may not be able to maintain good practices. We have
Right,
to
but
maintain-
Ed, I think
we
you're
may
being
have to
kind.
take the best practices we can do. That's
I don't know that they've ever focused on keeping it in sync throughout the year, even pre-COVID.
okay.
Normally what happens is when they write a budget, they are conservative with the revenues. And usually they go over expenses, but the revenue covers the increase in expenses. This year, that's not going to happen. It's not going to come close to happening.
Well,
if you
so
look on
Glenn-
the revenue side,
I had sent around a spreadsheet based on something Augie sent us where I highlighted things, you know, that I was just questioning from a budgeting perspective. And there were revenue categories, and I forgot where, I mean, one, I remember the numbers, I forgot the category, where we had budgeted 36,000 in revenue for the last fiscal year, we got 0. The year before we got 0. And we budgeted 36,000 again this year.
yeah,
Why
correct.
would we even think that's gonna happen? For 2 years in a row, we got 0.
We have Acorn that has 235,000 revenue side, expense side, and we haven't gotten any for the last couple of years. I've actually wrote Jerry that it should just be taken out of both sides of the budget.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, so I think, you know, if we're, I don't know if we want to bring in, I mean, there were also lots of expense categories that weren't going to happen. where we had spent zero money for 2 years, 3 years in a row, and we budgeted 2,000. The only reason why I was highlighting that was because Jerry, Augie, and all the department heads, as well as the board, went through all this work to get us under the 2% cap when a lot of the expense items were budgeted unnecessarily. So to me, those are kind of the guidelines that I think, we should have. If, that any expense item in the budget should be trending with prior year's expenditures, or if it's a huge increase, it needs to be justified. If it was zero for the last couple of years, leave it at zero. And same the revenue side, same thing. It needs to be in line with trends.
The other thing that you need is to understand that some revenues and some expenses only occur certain times of the year. And we should know that. We know that there's been no snow removal this year. I know that there's $1 million that has to be spent for the police department's retirement fund. Sales tax revenue comes in either 3 or 4 times a year. The tennis courts pay in December. So what we need is not only what the revenue is, but when the revenue tends to occur, in which quarter.
Yep.
But right now, we do have a problem with the revenues that are supposed to come in from fines and forfeitures because of the court closing. We normally bring in over $1 million. So far this year, we brought in 137,000. And there's no way you're going to make up that revenue. So you're probably looking at $350,000 or $400,000 shortfall, even if we got back to normal.
Dan,
And
maybe
also,
you can
the budget
elaborate on
wasn't
that.
in balance when we started. We were already borrowing $600,000 out of the reserve fund before we even had COVID. And then with COVID, we took some items and we turned them into bonded items such as police cars. Police cars don't have a lifespan of more than 5 years, and 80% of their value is gone after the first year, year and a half.
And that was done to keep us under the 2% cap.
Correct.
Yep.
There's also fire equipment that was done the same way.
Can we talk about the court closure and the revenue? I mean, it's remarkable, I think, that the sales tax revenue maintained itself the way that we did. I think we've all been enamored with that. The property tax, literally zero default rate, is, I think, also remarkable. So for the court closure to represent the revenue shortfall, which it does, Dan, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on this. Just two things. One, why hasn't this been able to be recovered more wholeheartedly electronically? And then, given parameters that could be put in place, do we know why this court can't open and COVID protocols be in place? I know there's risks, but it's just, what's driving all of this and what's the plan?
The reason that the court has not been able to generate the revenues that they would traditionally do is twofold. One is COVID has reduced what they can do. And two, the staff, there have been vacancies in the staff, and the staff does not have the sufficient personnel to undertake that. We believe that the staff issue will be corrected or completed, or the restaffing will be completed in the next week or so. There needs to be a change in the requirement for the court clerk, which is on the board's agenda for next Monday night.
What do you mean by requirement? Are we talking about hiring someone new or?
Yes, people have left for various reasons. So the staff was basically at 50%. And then the court was having trouble, meeting.
Convening, yeah.
Made arrangements to be able to get back up and running. And they are looking at options of trying to have more sessions in order to cut through the backlog. So that's the issue with the court. In terms of revenues and expenses, there is a gap. And this is very much in front of the village staff and the board. And it is an issue for discussion of direction to go next week.
A couple of other things on that. Remember, part of that fines and forfeiture is parking ticket revenue. And our meters were shut down for a month. And they're shut down this month. You're not writing any tickets at the train station because you have nobody parking there. And you have a reluctance of police officers to write tickets because of Corona. They are trying to have less encounter with the public. The last one, and I don't know how it affects it, is New York State has a no bail policy for minor infractions, and I don't know how that affects our budget.
Do we have a sense of what the total shortfall attributable to this is, and what component of that is due to the court being closed?
I know the court is down $1 million. I can't give you an answer to the rest.
The court itself is down $1 million, and then
Yes.
do we know, what percentage of are they still collecting electronically? Do they typically collect electronically, and are they currently collecting electronically?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
And I guess if the answer is yes,
Yeah, we
I
actually have a
assume
company
that
that
there's the
collects for us.
option, because I think I've done it myself.
We have a company
So
that actually
that
collects
electronic
electronically for
collection,
us.
right? And I think I've used it. That has presumably continued. And if the shortfall specifically attributable to the court is $1 million, that's irrespective of ongoing electronic collections. So we're saying that because there was staff turnover, that we left $1 million in arrears in fine collection because we didn't replace staff.
No, we also lost a lot of revenue because you weren't using your meters, and you can't write tickets if you're not using your meters.
Right. And I get it. That's what I'm trying to unpack. Is it $1 million total? What component
Yeah,
of the
you're
million
down.
is
You're down
attributable-
$1 million.
Well, no, the
You're down-
entire
so if you're
budget's
down
$1
$1 million in total.
You've collected 137 for half a year, so you're probably running a shortfall of about, because it's based on 5.5 months, you're probably a shortfall of 400,000 for the first half of the year, or the first 5 months of the year.
Okay, and of which that's going to be attributable to all the factors that we talked about, not just there being turnover in the court.
Correct.
We don't know what that number is, but I think that's an important point to make, that it's a multitude of factors.
Yeah. What you need to find out is
Okay, thank you.
what the backlog of unpaid fines and tickets are currently. Is there a current backlog, or is it the same type of backlog that you would normally have?
No, it's more than that. It's not business as usual. That's what's been happening. You did not have the staff to be able to process everything.
I guess to be continued. It sounds like you guys are tackling this within a week or two. So I know we talked about the ROI of that replacement a bunch of months ago, but
If there's been a reduction in staff, that ought to be reflected in a reduction of expense compensation to those people who are no longer there, which would be
Right.
some offset to the loss of revenue.
You're absolutely right. The amount of money that we pay to the company that collects the fines for us is down, and what we've paid for the court so far this year is down. They're probably about 25%. If you look at the revenue and expense sheet that Augie supplied at your last meeting, you can go down and you can look at the court spending so far for the year. I think it's somewhere around 28 or 30%.
all right. I guess to be continued. Did anyone have anything else on revenue?
Yeah, you have a couple of things that you have to watch. New York State has not yet given us the mortgage tax revenue, which is probably going to be down. The sales tax looks like it's actually going to be up because everybody is shopping from home instead of shopping in the city. But you'll have to get that number from Jerry. And then your revenue for parking is also down for, the first month that you lost of the year of that revenue. So that's trending down probably about $100,000 over the course of the year.
Why do you think the mortgage tax revenue will be down? Houses have been
You
flying.
didn't have as many transactions because everything was closed.
Right, but it then picked up and was totally crazy with crazy money also.
Oh yeah, they're spending a lot of money. They're just not doing as many sales because there's a lot of people who don't want to sell their houses. That's why it's a super hot market. If you actually look at the number of sales, they're not as high as they were last year because the houses just aren't available to buy.
All right.
Do people pay a mortgage recording tax on refinances? Because the news reports are that there's been significant refinancing because the interest rates are so low.
Well, that's why we got to get that number because, that's one of those numbers that you're really not going to know until you see it.
Okay.
I guess we just have to find out. All of that may or may not be happening. Clearly, nobody knows.
Nobody on this call.
That's right. Clearly.
Yeah. New York State, I know,
Speculation.
hasn't quite paid us what they're supposed to pay us. Same with Rye and such. But because we're a small town, I think that's another 25,000 or so. Our actual parking revenue is off a little bit. And depending on when the payments come in, we have to see how our moorings and boating revenue is. Because we got very little money for our summer programs this year. How many of them do we get before June 1st of next year?
But that goes to your earlier comment of where we need that timing schedule from Augie.
Correct. Right now, we show no tennis revenue. I was told by Jerry it was an annual contract and we get that money in like at the end of December. If we get camp money, does that go towards this year budget or is that actually held for next year when the camp actually takes place?
I think it goes towards this year, but I'm not sure.
And then the other one that is huge down is the railroad parking revenue. We were actually in the negative. We actually gave out more refunds than we sold permits. So that's another $300,000 between commuter and non-residential parking at the railroads.
Yep. You guys want to add a couple of bullets to this regarding timing of cash flows? Because we have covered that a lot. It's a pretty important point.
Well, it's all right. So that gets back to our initial conversation. This document was focusing on budget adjustments after the fact. So after the budget's approved, signed off, done and dusted. So timing is, to me, a normal event. That's not an adjustment focus.
Well, they have made certain adjustments. The central communication budget was off. They had to add money to that. They've already done that.
Right.
And I
Well,
know
that's
they've,
what, Glenn, at our prior meetings, we were discussing the adjustments, and that's what prompted this document.
yeah.
You know, we want to make sure there's an agreed upon with Jerry, the department heads and the board, you know, some kind of procedural way to view adjustments.
Yeah, because there were a lot of adjustments, there was a process that should be codified that would be followed on making adjustments.
Well, there's one large that is going to have to be looked at, and that's our legal expenses, because we're basically 2/3 through the budget, and we need to get estimates of what the costs are going to be with our continual lawsuits out there, as well as our normal legal costs. The other one that's tied into it is certiorarities. We actually spent $45,000 in legal expenses that we gave to the town of Mamaroneck. The town of Mamaroneck currently is who handles all the certiorarities. But we have to know how many certiorarities are currently a liability against the village, the timing of them, and then come up with a number between 30 and 70% of what our liability could be. Not just for this year, for 2 or 3 years. Commercial certiorarities can go back as long as 7 years.
Do you guys want to recap a plan then for next steps with the document? If there's more internal work to do, if not, what next steps would be to present further, get Jerry's feedback, you know, his team, and kind of go through a similar type of process that we did with the capital budget recommendations?
Yeah, I think we can look at the budget and just ask when certain expenses are going to be paid, and certain revenues are going to be paid to us. That way you have a idea of when these items are going to hit, and then you can adjust as you see them come in.
Yeah, but Charles, from what we were initially setting out to do with this document, to come up with procedures for requests for an official budget adjustment, I think this document is fine. I like where we are with it.
I think it came together brilliantly and quickly. If there's little tweaks that we want to make, we can always do that. We can get feedback going forward. Would you agree that next steps would be to distribute this for comment to, let's say, to Jerry and his team?
Yeah, I would say Jerry and Augie, just to get their feedback.
Yep.
Could I just make a comment about the revenue shortfall section?
Sure.
I wonder whether the items should be presented in a different sequence. It seems as though the most stringent action, consider a moratorium, is something that is more likely to be done after a review of revenue and expenditure assumptions. In other words, we might present them sequentially as opposed to the order that they're currently in.
Well, part of what I was thinking, Bill, which is kind of in line with what you're saying, I think some of the bullet points we have are kind of overriding whether it's expense or revenue. So I'll take a stab over the next couple of days of not changing any of the words, but restructuring the document, and I'll get it out to everyone for their feedback. And if everyone approves, I'll then forward it on to Jerry and Augie and get their feedback.
Okay.
Does that work for everyone?
Sounds good to me.
I think, Bill, when I first read that, I had this exact same reaction as you, except when I thought about it a bit, it says consider a board approved spending moratorium. In other words, we realize that there's a problem. So the first step would be to raise a red flag and stop, meaning if things are so bad, you may want to stop hiring, although we want to make sure we hire people who are going to bring in more revenue.
Right.
But we have to think about what positions we fill or what contracts that, if they can be terminated, should be terminated or could be terminated. That would buy us some time as we review the revenue and expenditure assumptions. Now, at this point in time, at this point in the fiscal year, one would think that Jerry and Augie would be saying, okay, here's where we are now, and over the next 5 or 6 months, here's how much revenue we expense by item, and here's our expected expenditures. And the timing issue, of course, fits in there, but that seems to be an essential part of what should happen right now. And part of that relates to the what if scenarios.
Right, but Len, the reason why I think that should be an overriding blurb for both revenue and expenses. So let's say we're hitting our revenue numbers. In an ideal world, we're not getting more than we planned, but we're hitting our numbers. But our expenses are out of control. We should also look at a moratorium on other expenses if we've got large ticket items that came in that weren't planned for.
That's true. You're absolutely right. And therefore, my view doesn't change with respect to the sequence that's listed here in the document.
Right, but I'm thinking maybe that first bullet under revenue shortfall isn't specific to revenue or expense. It's for both.
That's a fair point. You're exactly right. That's a fair point.
Right, so I think that should come before, at the very beginning.
But when you think about it, this entire section is not purely revenue oriented.
Exactly.
In other words, it's really a budget shortfall, you want to call, or some other name, because it's not exclusive to revenues, as you point out. And therefore, because we talk a lot about expenses here exclusively, but it could apply to both sides of the equation. So if there's a budget shortfall, that would require us to dip into reserves,
Right.
or do some other more serious action, then that should be considered. So,
Well, then maybe we shouldn't call section 2 a revenue shortfall, but a budget shortfall.
from my perspective, that's fine. I don't know what the others on the committee think.
Yeah, I think that's right, because all of the recommendations refer to cutting expenses. They don't really refer to increasing revenue.
I'll keep the bullet points.
Hello?
You froze, Ellen. We lost her.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm back to what I said before. I'll keep the words exactly as they are. I'll just restructure this document, because it really is budget shortfall.
Right.
And if you want to put something in that basically gives you your choices, because you only have so many choices. You can increase property tax, you can increase other revenue, you can cut, you can freeze, you can bond, or you can spend out of the reserve fund. That's it.
Yep. And mid-year, you can't increase property tax.
Exactly, and you can't increase a lot of other fees because their increases start June 1st.
Yep.
But they are
Okay.
thinking of doing things like putting parking meters on the Boston Post Road.
Yeah, it seems like they want to put it in front of our apartment complex, so.
Well, I'm looking at maybe, yeah, they want to go up and down the Post Road. I think they're probably better off not starting it until 10 a.m. in the morning, but that's something that could be discussed. The problem is if they simply don't put the meters in front of your apartments, anybody in the village of Mamaroneck can park there, so everybody from Harbor Island can park in those spots on a Saturday. But that's a different discussion.
Yep.
No, that is.
Okay, so Ellen, you're gonna make a couple of small changes and then we can distribute this to Jerry and Augie.
Well, I'll get it out to the group first to make sure everyone's on board with how I've structured it.
Great.
And then I'll send it once I get everyone's okay. Or at least 2 people, 3 people.
Awesome.
Wait, all you have to do is as long as you don't get any negative response.
Right, I'll put in the bottom of my email. If I don't hear from you in the next 10 minutes, I assume you agree. So I'll send it back out to the group, and then once we're all on board, I'll forward it to Jerry and Augie to get their feedback.
Fantastic. Did anyone have anything else they wanted to talk about tonight? This was pretty dense. We covered a ton of things. Glenn, thank you for all the feedback with your first participation. That was really impressive. We're looking forward to you. Did anyone have anything they wanted to talk about, or are we good for now?
I just have a couple of things, Charles, could I mention?
Cool.
First is, I know Alan sent a document, I think, I'm not sure if it was to Jerry, Alan, about the cost of events, the revenues and expenses.
Yep,
And you said, was it Jason from Recreation
he was starting to work on it. I don't know where that stands.
okay.
Nor do I know if Jerry has reached out to anybody else, because 100% of our events, lack of a better word, aren't sponsored by the rec department. Like the St. Patrick's Day Parade or the Fireman's Parade. That's not the rec department.
Right. But he was going to try to complete that form. Alan sent a form, just for the benefit of everyone else, for us to look at the revenue, the true costs of supporting these events.
Yep.
Compared to the revenue that we receive.
So Jason was only going to work on rec department sponsored events, but he was going to reach out to like the police department. He was going to get all in costs, which he never does in his budget. But anything the rec department sponsored, he was going to do front to back.
Yeah.
And Jerry was supposed to follow up on the rest.
Okay, so that's still an open item.
Yep.
Okay. Now, the next thing, even if you look at the controller's document, and thanks, Ed, for sharing that. It does mention in that document, I was pleased to see, Ellen, where it said you should know the true costs,
Yep.
services you provide, and somewhere, I think, in this budget document, there should be a place for something like that in terms of, this is not just budget adjustments, but these are budget guidelines that are broader than adjustments. And I think that was a good notion that you had, and something that we should put in this budget document, and that whatever we do as a village, that for anything, is that we should understand what the true costs, the full complete costs of that activity is. And we went through the whole police fee question, where we didn't really calculate all of the fringe benefits and any other related costs, and made an adjustment. And I think that this would be a helpful thing to include from sort of a recommendation in a good practice, as the controller pointed out.
Right. There's actually on the controller's website, which I've been on a lot because I'm also on another committee. There's a whole lot of
Ellen, you fade out again.
Yeah.
Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. I'll take a look at the controller's website and see if I can glean any other important facts or things to include. And we'll include a general guideline, budget guideline section in this document.
Thank you.
Lynn, did you have another topic you wanted to bounce around?
I just, and I'm just mentioning this for the group when we were talking about the capital budget. The form that Ellen prepared, which had specific projects, it's very difficult for us to monitor the capital budget in the form of the report that Augie sent and that you shared earlier, Charles, because it's not specific enough. It's very general. Let's say it's an accounting document. It's not a budget document. And therefore, is what I did, Alan, is I took your budget document and converted it into a report form in which we would look at expenditures and encumbrances for each project, or, for each, have the list of projects and then identify for each project where we've spent money and encumbered funds. So.
All right, it should probably be, and you'll probably have to add.
Well, on that point, what you actually would need is, once the village or the village manager enters into a contract on a capital project, is to look at what the spending would be under the contract, and then the village itself, as they get the bills in, they every meeting approve expenses, and you can go there and very easily see what they have spent on the capital projects, because it's once they actually get a bill in and it's approved by the trustees, it would be part of that. It's part of that document. Current spending and capital is both spent, both have to be approved as the bills are paid. So you need the contract to tell you what they're spending on the project, and as the trustees approve the bills, you can see how far along the contract is.
So I have a question, and Glenn, I don't know if you can answer it, or Dan, if you can. But if any one of these capital projects is being funded by a grant, does the village pay the bill so that it would show up on this sheet that Charles has up now as we've expended, and then we get reimbursed? Or does the grant pay
Almost all the
directly?
grants are, you spend the money first, get all the itemized accounting and everything together and submit it, and then you get reimbursed.
So for example, I'm, making this up, but the 39,000 for the Parks Department, if that's being funded by a grant, we're not gonna know this from this spreadsheet. We're gonna see we spent 30.
That is correct. So you probably would need a line to, an additional column to say where funding is coming from.
Yep.
Okay, I don't know if you know this, Dan, or Glenn, or anyone. If you look at the report that Charles has on the screen, for the year-to-date actual expended, that's clear. The trustees approve the bills, the money is, quote, spent. The cash goes out the door. An encumbrance, at least in the past have seen, is essentially if you sign a contract, that's an encumbrance. Okay. In other words, on what's on the screen now, miscellaneous equipment or capital project, there's a line there that has $83,000 in the Parks Department.
Yep.
Of which 83,000 has been encumbered. Now, presumably that's a contract or a commitment that's been made of some kind. So So I think I presume, although I don't know, if you add the budget, the years expended, there's a relationship between expenditures and encumbrances. Let me say it that way, as I understand it.
And we'll have to get with Augie to probably revisit this document and come up with another one, because this is seemingly commingling. If you see here, 2019, all the way back to 2014.
Yeah.
And what this is reflecting, and to be able to look at this mainly, for the current year and look at the trend, same concept, but with respect to that $11 million number and where we stand with these items in Ellen's format, which comprise basically the capital budget.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Charles. I didn't do a good job of explaining. I mean, I think the whole issue of contracts and expenditures should be reflected in that report, that the report from Augie. In other words, if encumbrances are indeed contracts and actual expenditures are indeed cash that's out the door, then we have what we know. I mean, we have what we need to know in terms of our capital budget. Unless we want to look at specific contracts, that's another issue. But
Right, but you also don't know the timing of those contractual payments. Some might be this year, some might be next year.
well, I would hope presumably there's typical terms, and again, this is, I think we have to talk about. If someone does some work, you generally pay them within some time.
Right, no, but it could be a 2-year project is what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's fair enough.
And then you need to
But that-
know what
Ellen,
we're
that-
getting from grants.
But Ellen, that should not be encumbered. The 2 years shouldn't be encumbered in this one budget.
That's right.
Well, except, would it be if it's
Not
one
encumbered.
contract?
Carry.
Hello?
Hi, if it's one contract, wouldn't it be encumbered this year? I mean, even if it covers 2 years?
I wouldn't think of it, if it's encumbered, it's only the amount encumbered that's expected to be paid this year.
Yeah, I think so. But again, we'll have to answer that
I mean,
question.
but that's a question. I mean, we don't know
Yep.
what it really means. But to me, it didn't, if it's in this budget as encumbered for this budget, then it's only for this year.
All right,
But that's just an assumption.
I believe you're right. Like, they're in contract for a fire truck. If they're gonna receive that, or they're in contract for equipment and they're gonna receive it in May, I think that's what they use for the encumbered.
Yeah, well, that's easy on something like a truck or a equipment.
Well,
because-
I didn't mean a truck, I mean like the air packs.
Yeah,
You
anything
might have
like
some-
that, anything like that is easy because it's one item. What Ellen was referring to was a construction project that would overlap fiscal years, let's say like.
Yeah, I think what they do is they just break that up into each year. They, if you look at the way you've done capital, it'll say paving 80,000, 2020, 2021, 80, and then they'll break up that type of project.
right, no, but it was the contract that I was questioning, not the way we plan the money.
That would be a question for higher authority.
Yep,
I think we have to resolve that.
Now, I do have one question about the overall budget, and I asked the trustees the other day. Augie gave the expense control report, and he gave the revenue report. And the year-to-date adopted budget is 38,912. The revenues adjusted, let's get the last page, are 36,931,000. That's a difference of $2 million. I know they were planning to take 600,000 out of the reserve fund. Where's the other 1.4 million coming from? And that doesn't include any shortfalls in revenue for this year.
So when I asked Jerry that question a month ago about the budget adjustments and asked where the money was coming from, he said the reserve fund.
So that would put the reserve fund at $2 million. Just all I'm looking at is the document, the revenue control report that Augie supplied to this committee. I downloaded it. If you look at the budget that they presented, you know, it's $2 million out of whack.
Right.
And that's before any adjustments. I know they were planning 600,000 out of the reserve funds. Was another 1.4 million being bonded somewhere? I just don't know where the other 1.4 million is going to be coming from.
If it's needed, Jerry said it would be coming from the reserve fund. Look, they thought they were going to have a huge shortfall this past year, and we ended up having close to $1 million in excess.
Well, not quite, because of that million, we had already said that we were going to take 600,000 out of the reserve fund, and we didn't.
No, but the point that I'm making is,
Yes.
if we're looking at the adjusted expense budget, and that's one of the spreadsheets I sent out last month, I believe, where there's a whole lot of stuff budgeted that we haven't spent money in those accounts for 2-3 years. All of that adds up to a good chunk of change.
Yeah. But there's other items that we're going to be way over on, which includes legal expense. And it's not so much about the expense side, it's more about the revenue side. The revenue side, we're 2 million out of balance right now, and that doesn't include over $500,000 that I pointed out to you.
Yep.
And as part of this budget, we already were bonding police cars and fire equipment and other items that shouldn't be in a 20-year bond. At best, they should be in a 5-year bond.
Yeah, but that's okay. Police cars are typically financed, at least. I've seen that many times in the past, not here, not in the village. You know, they do a serial bond presumably. So that doesn't trouble me as much as the if it indeed is a $2 million looking to dip in the reserve fund to that extent.
Yeah. Well, all of you have a copy of that report from your last meeting, so just take a
Yep.
look at it. Yeah. And the one problem you have is, if it's serial bonds, I don't have a problem. But when you go to bonding, sometimes what they like to do is play cleanup, take all these debts, put them into one bond, and then just bond the whole thing to clean it up. We've had in the past where certiorarities were actually bonded for 20 years.
Whoa.
one of the bright side is starting next year, there was a revalve in Rye Neck, and you should be seeing revenue increases because the properties in Rye Neck have significantly increased in value outside of the most expensive. The residents might not be thrilled about it, but I'm sure Augie already has the number of the what the revalve is worth, so you can see what the value of the property in Rye Neck is going to be next year as opposed to this year. The one thing we have to be careful about is certiorarities, because commercial properties are going to be filing against the Village of Mamaroneck. You already have the CVS property that's now a church. You have the Chase Bank, which is now a temple. Those two are coming off the tax rolls. Miller's has been closed for over a year. Lumien's closed for over a year. And a lot of landlords have given rent breaks to try to keep their tenants alive. So you might not see it this year, next year, but over the next couple of years, you're going to see a lot of commercial certiorarities. And I think Hampshire has a case right now in Avalon. Those are the ones that we have to look into to see if we're going to be hit with any of that expense this year. We're budgeted like 300 and something thousand. I think we spent 41 so far. So that could either be a revenue, an expense windfall, or it could go the other way. It goes the same way. So.
Is Charles still on the meeting?
You're on mute, Charles.
I think we should add that to next month's agenda to unpack the shortfall that we just were talking of and better understand that as well. The list keeps growing.
Yep.
Does anyone have anything else for tonight?
I hope everybody had a very happy Thanksgiving, happy Hanukkah. Enjoy Christmas, your holiday season. Please, let's everybody stay safe. Let's hope the vaccine starts to roll out next year and the revenues start to pick up.
Yeah, and
Indeed.
we hope you recover quickly, Charles.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And
Are
Abby,
your Charles, are your kids okay?
They are. My wife has it. We don't know how he got it. It's been rough, and I think there's pneumonia involved, so I'm just
Ugh.
battling it out. Yeah, unfortunately. Stay safe, everyone. We probably need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
In favor?
Aye.
I,
Aye.
Happy holidays, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you. You too.
You take care,
Thanks.
everyone.
Nice to meet everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye now.
Good to meet
Bye,
you,
Glenn.
Glenn.
Bye.
Good night.